Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. We are finally in the final stretch, 2 weeks less than that, actually, the one and a half, leading up to WWDC 2025. And yes, I'm saying 2025 explicitly in the name because we are going to get to why year branding will become pretty important, at least for Apple's software, though it leads us to speculate what it could mean for Apple's hardware. Of course, we do have other topics to discuss today, some smaller stuff, some bigger stuff. Hello, one and all. I'm very glad very grateful to anyone who finds me. Very glad that the community keeps growing while we are preparing for DubDub. I know my schedule isn't really the best for like a YouTube live streamer career, but hey, it's a fun hobby. I love you guys having you guys here. You can go to my posts on YouTube and see me announcing my Discord. I've created it like 2 or 3 weeks ago, didn't do much with it. I think it's a great place, or it is going to turn into a great place to just speak with people, and you don't necessarily have to agree on all topics with me, but to speak with people who primarily focus on Apple and kind of Apple adjacent technology, and with people who try to look into it with a little bit more nuance. Like I saw, for example, Snazzy Labs commenting on one of the story that I will be breaking down today, and I was already like, oh my god, so much freaking negativity towards everything. So yeah, it's not going to be an Apple sucker fest. It's not going to be in the Apple sheep forum or whatever, but it is going to be, hopefully, at least that's what I'm trying to achieve, a distinct place from everything else, right? It's not going to be as big as Twitter, obviously, or something like that, but it should bring people together who I think could interact in much more meaningful and direct ways than just throwing out their opinion quickly on a new topic, trying to be edgy, trying to be confrontational, and then moving on. But before we get fully started with the actual breakdown of all of the topics, shout out for you guys to do all the YouTube jazz, as we call it around here. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with anybody who you think might enjoy it, and comment. You know, I love interacting with a lively comment section, getting your agreements, your disagreements, just your general opinions. In the future, we'll look into Discord integration, into all of this, reading your messages more directly, potentially taking calls and stuff like that. This is going to be a development. Most of it will happen after DubDub, but leading up to WWDC, I do want to do more for like the social media aspect of this channel. I might even return to Twitter, not to actually be there, but to just post all the links, Blue Sky, Threads, Discord now, informing you about the latest videos going live, informing you whenever I'm going in a hiatus, which you guys know might happen somewhat regularly with me. I'm definitely not going back to Twitter in like a personal fashion, but hey, if I can reach a few more guys there, I think that's going to be helpful. Without further ado, let's actually get started. We have plenty to talk about, and primarily we do have one giant piece of news coming from Mark Gurman, and it was actually already independently verified by somebody at Apple Insider. So hopefully that is actually realistic and hopefully true, because I actually really like this rumor. We have Angelica and Rosa already coming in saying hi in the chat. Thank you guys so much. As always, for everyone who wants to support this channel, you can become a channel member right here. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, and Max Maximus, our Mark Jack Pro Max supporters. You can become a supporter over on Patreon. You can send super chats and super stickers right while I'm live. So that's finally it for the intro. Let's get started. Thank you, Mark Gurman, for actually some hard details. Now, I know it's not necessarily the feature analysis that most of us would like to see, but but granted, I do actually prefer seeing the features at dub, so not getting everything spoiled before we get into it. However, getting something like this, to me, is actually really interesting. We have Riley joining the chat, long-term supporter of the channel. Thank you so much. So what exactly am I alluding to? And obviously you see it from the title. There have been YouTube videos made on this already. There have been speculation videos on what it means for Apple hardware too already. So this is blowing up really big in the Apple community. We are talking about the branding of Apple's operating systems. So obviously OS in all of Apple's iOS, macOS, visionOS, right, tvOS, watchOS, all that stuff. By the end of the year, we should also be getting HomeOS that would power like HomePad, and potentially it is somewhat arguable if it could be like a replacement for tvOS too. It's definitely going to be an exciting and a very big portfolio of software at that point. But Apple is updating their operating systems pretty much annually. So this year, for example, we expected to get iOS 19, and I almost forget which version of macOS we would be on, right? We would get visionOS 3, new versions of watchOS, but you already see that it's really hard to keep up like what version model or what version we are on, right? Because for one, those operating systems don't align with each other in terms of numbers, but they also don't align with anything else, right? The only thing they basically align on is, at some point we launched iOS, right? And it's been 19 years basically since then, right? That's how we get to iOS 19. That might make sense if you have only one operating system, or if you're even updating it very kind of like how I stream, like, right, very unpredictably, maybe having big gaps. That's, for example, what's happening with Windows, right? We are on Windows 11 for years. We were on Windows 10 for years. We were on Windows 7 for years. And yeah, there was even Windows 8 in between, but that's also like a little bit confusing. Just trying to say, Apple does not have those excuses. Now, Android doesn't have those excuses either, but Android does have the advantage that there is very little like big platform stuff coming from Android that people actually care about in terms of branding, right? We have Android 16. We have not watchOS. We have Wear OS being updated, right? Like Android TV, nobody cares what version of that it's on. Then there is like an independent, like even like car platform based on Android. Nobody cares which version of Android that's based on. Usually they even like brand it after the Android version behind it, right? Like, it's Android 16 based or something like that. So it's not as important to give it its own number. I believe they have them, but I don't think anybody cares. iOS obviously powers billions of devices in the world, iPhones, iPads, all those different versions, macOS on hundreds of millions of products, devices at this point, right? watchOS, Apple Watch is super successful. Even tvOS, right, is pretty relevant to the people who actually like and interact with their Apple TVs. Like me, like once I come home, basically my Apple TV is always on and waiting for me to do something with it. So now Apple is trying to go away from the old branding, right, which is the number based on how many updates there have been, and trying to align it with a year. Now, the one obviously surprising thing is that at WWDC 2025, Apple will not be announcing iOS 25, macOS 25, right? They will be announcing iOS 26, macOS 26, watchOS 26, tvOS 26, visionOS 26. Who knows? Maybe HomeOS 26 at this point. Right, so let's see how Mark Gurman is breaking this down. Apple Inc. is planning the most sweeping change yet to its operating system names, part of a software overhaul that extends to all of its devices. What's important here, of course, it's not just a rebranding entirely for the sake of rebranding, for the sake of simplicity and stuff like that, but it does actually line up with something new, right? When we initially thought that iOS 19 would be a big redesign, right? That kind of made iOS stick out for the software operating systems that we were supposed to get at DubDub. Then we found out, oh, macOS is getting the same changes, which brings us now to 3 operating systems: iOS, iPadOS, and macOS, right? But even more importantly, now we find out watchOS, tvOS, and of course visionOS is already what that design is based on, are also getting these updates, and a big part of those updates is consistency, right? So if you're moving from one Apple product to the other, you are getting something that looks similar, behaves similar, has similar functionality. Obviously there will be differences, right? But now it would make less sense than ever to have this completely disjointed branding in terms of the version number for all of those operating systems. And Apple is solving that. So instead of going from iOS 18, which is where we are now, to iOS 19, which you guys know is what was expected. I mean, if you look back at like even my thumbnails, not even having to go back to the actual videos, you will find me putting like 19 in the title and stuff like that. But now we are actually moving to iOS 26. And as I already alluded to, it's not lining up with the year where it's being released. Obviously, it's going to release sometime in September, most likely. But it's lining up with the year where it will have the most relevance. So this is similar to car branding, right? So the latest Mercedes, BMW model and stuff like that, they might come out even sometime in July or August, right? But they will be branded after the next year, because when you think about it, that's probably when it's going to have like its biggest impact, right? Often when something gets announced, it takes a few months for it to actually come to the market, to meet all demand, yada, yada, yada. And even more importantly, with software, you actually have, of course, the difference. Not only do you get a new iOS version in September, for example, but you then get iOS 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 releases, and most of those actually happen the next year, right? So that's why Apple is going to call it 26 rather than 25. And of course, the counter argument to like the competition here is, for example, the Galaxy S25, then next year the Galaxy S26, right? Those devices are coming out very early in the year, February, March, right? Stuff like that. So Apple wouldn't want to call their major iOS release 25 at the time when Samsung is talking about the Galaxy S26, right? That's a little bit of a petty squabble that you get between companies, but that's kind of how decades ago we got into the car branding that we have right now, right? Over time, most companies didn't want to be left behind by calling their cars after the year it was released, so they started naming it after the next year, and over time, basically every car company did that, and yeah, it seems like I wouldn't be surprised if Samsung might react to this in some way, but then again, this is for now only for software, so we can speculate whether or not that means if the iPhone 17 becomes the iPhone 26, right? I could also argue that maybe for hardware, it makes more sense, instead of calling it with a clear number, that Apple instead calls it the iPhone and then in brackets year 2026 or late 2026 release, right? That's what historically they have done, for example, with Macs over time. Now there's a little bit more branding based on the processor that it's inside, but we still have that. And we even have like different model distinctions on iPad that are kind of informal, right? Like the iPad Pro technically is just called iPad Pro, but when you go to like buy accessories for it, you will have iPad Pro 4, 5th, 6th generation. So for example, I'm finally replacing that like completely broken crap that is my Logitech Combo Touch case. And so I bought a Taurus case, one that has like dual hinges and everything, and it protects the pencil separately, right? Really cool thing. And it's compatible with the latest iPad Pros, and there's the version compatible with the latest iPad Airs. But what's funny about that version is also compatible with multiple generations of iPad Pros, because they have pretty much, older iPad Pros have pretty much the same form factor, like pretty similar thickness, pretty much identical in terms of X and Y axes, right, as the new iPad Air. So when I actually initially saw it, I was like, oh man, it's only compatible with the iPad Air. But then at some point I looked into the details list and it said, oh, it's actually compatible with like model 4, 5, and 6 of the iPad Pro. And I was like, yes, right, because one of those is my M1 iPad Pro from 2021. So again, Apple's branding is still not perfect, and there are complications there, but I do believe that at least for software, this will be the right steps. And of course, Mark Gurman points out that also means we're getting iPadOS 26, macOS 26, watchOS 26, tvOS 26, and visionOS 26 officially at WWDC 2025. Apple is making the change to bring consistency to its branding and move away from an approach that can be confusing to customers and developers. Today's operating systems, including iOS 18, watchOS 12, right? I always forget we are already on watchOS 12. I always think we are on watchOS 11, but about to get 12. No, we are at 12, and kind of were about to get 13, but now we're getting literally double of what we expect, moving from 13 to 26. macOS 15, half the time I forget which macOS version we're on, because I always associate macOS numbers more with like the place in California that it's named after, or something in California that it's named after. Like right now it's Sequoia. That I remember, but honestly, the number, not so much. Vision OS, that's not too difficult to remember because Vision Pro is not that old of a product. So I know that at last year's WWDC, we got the first major revision of Vision OS, so Vision OS 2. This year, it would be the second major version of Vision OS, so Vision OS 3. But now I don't even have to make that calculation in my head. Now all of this is 26. So right now they all use different numbers because their initial versions didn't debut at the same time. Even, by the way, with macOS, of course, when you look at, for example, OS 10 before that, we would now be like way into the 30s when it comes to like what it's named after, like when you would name it after like how many years have passed since the initial version, right? So even with macOS, Apple kind of took OS 10, right? The 10 written with a Roman numeral X. And then at some point they said, oh, if that was macOS, and then when they switched to macOS branding, they said, oh, the previous version was like macOS 10, so now we are at macOS 11. Now that makes sense, of course, as they moved towards Apple Silicon specifically, it made sense to make that kind of rebranding. But now it's just completely incoherent from iOS. Even iOS, by the way, iOS 18 is not the 18th version of iOS. It's technically like the 14th, because iOS actually only started to be called iOS at like iOS 4. Before that, it was technically iPhone OS. So, and iPad OS is technically not anything because iPad OS used to be called iOS. So yeah, there is just like, if you actually wanted to analyze these numbers, they make even less sense than they do on the surface. A spokesperson for Cupertino, California-based Apple. Okay, that's like very detailed. Could have just said a spokesperson for Apple declined to comment. Of course, that's always going to happen. Apple is not in the business of commenting on leaks and rumors. I mean, if they did, it would be like a never-ending shit show, right? There are new Apple leaks and rumors basically daily. The company will announce the shift at its Worldwide Developers Conference on June 9th. So I invite you, of course, to join me on June 9th to my live stream, and in the subsequent week to, of course, a lot more coverage after this, as I installed the beta versions on my iPhone, my iPad, my Mac, my Apple Watch, probably my Apple TV too. I don't own a Vision Pro headset, so that would be the only product that doesn't get like analysis from me, like how the newest betas perform. Of course, all of those operating systems will also get fresh user interfaces, with the one being least updated being Vision OS, because that's kind of what's inspiring the others. However, Mark Gurman has also talked about in the past how Vision OS 3 is actually a big feature release. Now, that is interesting because I almost wonder like how long Apple has been working on all of this, because having a redesign in everything and a lot of new features, like for example, we expect iPadOS to gain a lot of the productivity features we typically associate with macOS. And then on macOS, we expect changes to bring it somewhat more in line with how people expect their iPads to behave. To also have like a big feature release for Vision OS simultaneously, while updating the design of everything else to look a little bit more like Vision OS, sounds impressive. I hope they really don't screw it up, because this could really be a big chance. Like, I personally have never bought into all the like I believe there's like a recent Luke Mayeni video. I didn't watch it because honestly, like what can I say about it, because it's not something that I share as a belief at all. It's like, it's not just you. iOS is a mess, and I use iOS daily, I use iPadOS daily, I use macOS daily, I use watchOS on every day where I don't have a day off. Today I'm just spending my day at home, thankfully. I have a long weekend for once, so I'm totally relaxing without an ultra on my wrist. But like, no. But however, if you are somebody who believes this, you are wrong, for one. But now Apple is providing a good opportunity for people to change their mind. There's a big rebranding. There's a redesign coinciding with that rebranding. There's a consistency argument. So if you're somebody who have always disliked, for example, that iPadOS doesn't have many macOS features, or if you are like me and you are more of an iPad person, but you still own a Mac for like the absolute productivity beast that they can be, now you get the benefit of your Mac maybe being a little bit more consistent with your iPad, right? I think this is a big opportunity for Apple to change people's minds, including, of course, when it comes to Apple Intelligence. After all the delays last year for like the newest version of Apple Intelligence, Siri, personal context, on-screen awareness, stuff like that, I think it's a good opportunity. Plus, I think calling it after the year, it also excuses one thing way better that previously people used to dislike, which is not all features that are being talked about at WWDC come in like let's say in iOS 18.0, right? A lot of the stuff that was promised for iOS 18 arrived in iOS 18.1, 0.2, even all the way up to iOS 18.4. And right now we are on 0.5. That's a little bit more of a refinement update, but then we're probably going to get an iOS 18.6 as like a bridge release towards iOS 26, and then we might get iOS 18.7, which would be like the security release that you can still install on your devices, while iOS 20, if you, for example, are a little bit too afraid, maybe you have like some really work crucial apps and something on your iPhone, so you don't want to install the latest version right away. So this would be, of course, a lot more excusable at this point, because the most of those kinds of point 1, point 2, especially everything after like point 3 updates for 26, those will be happening in the year of 2026. So maybe having these more delayed or scheduled or stepped update plans will be more acceptable to the broader public now that the operating system is called after the year where most of those kinds of smaller updates come in. Riley, the whole "it doesn't happen to my device, so it's wrong" is never a good look. I can customize my wallpaper in landscape mode on iPad for some reason. I'm not saying there aren't bugs on iOS. I don't understand why people, and Riley, you're great. I really like you. You are a great supporter of this channel. But I really don't understand why people cannot accept this very small concept. And I have this disagreement with a lot of political people too, because even in politics and stuff, I usually have a pretty nuanced, somewhat middle of the road position, not on extreme guys. That's a different position, right? I'm not saying iOS is perfect. I'm not saying iOS doesn't have issues, but iOS has always had issues. Every operating system has always had issues. Like, I believe it was like a month ago where we randomly went, where before the stream, I randomly went to 9to5 Google, and I found like 3 articles just spawning over 5-6 days, where people were like, "Oh, there's a huge bug in watchOS, in Wear OS with notifications. There is like an alarm, not working alarm stuff, and on Android there's like a pairing issue," right? And that was just for Wear OS. So no, I'm not saying that iOS doesn't have issues. I don't like, for example, the iOS notification center that much. I think it involves too many gestures and stuff like that. Granted, I actually don't share the belief that Android is much better, but I guess it's in some ways more customizable. I love the iOS control center. I think almost everything else outside of it is garbage. But for example, I have zero problems calling out that when iOS 18 came out, control center sorting on the screen was completely broken. And it was broken all the way up to iOS 18.4. And I called that out with you guys. Do you actually think that after all this time that you spend with me, I am somebody who denies issues? However, I will never say that those smallish issues are enough to call iOS a mess, iPadOS a mess. I've seen people say like, "Oh," for example, Surge doesn't work for them in settings on macOS. And I acknowledge that it's been an issue for people. But I've had literally every version of macOS betas over the last 3-4 years, and it has never happened to me. And it's not like I'm just saying from my experience. I have had dozens of people on Twitter, and now I have a few people on Blue Sky and stuff like that, who were giving me their impressions. There will always be bugs, but a certain amount is acceptable, so I see where it's coming. Android is not better, true, but some points have better battery life. That's of course. I have no problem, like, for the very reason, like, I go to, for example, a website like GSM Arena, right? But I don't do that because iPhones win battery life there, like they do, like the Pro Max wins against the others. But for example, when iOS has a little bit of a bug or some kind of like background task that's coming in, then yeah, I fully acknowledge that it would perform worse than a device with a 6,000 milliamp hour battery. I also acknowledge that just from a hardware perspective, it's exciting to get like potentially like a over 7,000 milliampere hour battery on a phone. Certainly over 6,000 even versus the iPhone position where we are at, right? Like the best iPhone comes in at below 4,700 milliampere hours. I also don't have a problem with saying, oh, there are bigger sensors. That even though I believe Apple has the absolute best night mode and the best color representation in Pro RAW, like regular photos, I don't like them on any phone right now. That's why I love Pro RAW. Granted, it makes images outrageously large, but I still think it's a feature that's absolutely unbeaten, right? But I don't have a problem in admitting, yeah, if Apple used a similar size sensor, then Apple wouldn't be on par with 1-inch camera, 1-inch sensor Android devices. Apple would be way better, and I would like for that to happen. So no, I am cooling. Cooling is one thing where I've called out Apple repeatedly, not just as like something that needs to be a little bit improved, but the 16 Pro Max from the 16 series, it needs a little bit of improvement. From the 14 and 15 series, it needs a good improvement, but below the 14 series, it needs like a revolutionary improvement, right? And I've always been open to say that, as I've been always open to admit that there are bugs. But don't go here chasing me and saying I'm some kind of bug denier. I'm just saying iOS is not a mess. I don't care. Like, this is way too big of a statement. But hey, it gets clicks, right? On a channel with 522K, getting over 100K in one day, that's impressive. Good for you, Luke. Moving on, or moving back, I guess. The latest naming strategy is reminiscent of approaches taken by both Samsung and Microsoft. Now, I'm interesting, like, it's not the current approach, of course, by Microsoft, but yeah, in the past they called like Windows 95, 98, Windows 2000. Now, of course, we are way beyond that actually convenient branding on Windows, and now we have no idea when, for example, Windows 11 will move into like Windows 12 finally. But yeah, we also had Apple previously doing something similar like that. I'm actually really glad that Mark Gurman brings that up, because that immediately came to my mind, because I used to love the keynotes from those years. But yeah, their iWork and iLife suites, this is Pages, Keynote, and Numbers, this is GarageBand, iMovie, and before that, like stuff like iWeb. They were also called after the release year. Well, now we aren't calling it after the release year, but something similar to that. Right, so we got iWork 08 and iLife 08. Oh, it actually was called after the new year. Well, then it's actually completely precedented. I guess that's actually my own memory betraying me. Thank you, Mark Gurman. So this is big shout out. Usually, you know, guys know I can be plenty critical of Mark Gurman, some Mark on Mark violence here. But yeah, I actually didn't know that iLife 11, for example, was introduced in October 2010. So that actually means that Apple is doing something that has precedence not only in the broader industry, which of course cars are the best example, but even in their own company history. And of course, if you know Steve Jobs loved cars, so him being actually like inspired in terms of branding by that absolutely makes sense back in the day. And of course now it makes sense to like reinvigorate that kind of branding concept. Some brief summary again about the features that are expected to come. The iPad gets more Mac-like experience, potentially making it more useful for office work. I would argue office work, it's like the change that needs the least. Like it's the kind of workflow that needs the least changing on iPad. But okay, I guess there was also rumors about like a more open, more free, like control stage manager. So that I guess makes sense, especially for like just keeping multiple apps side by side. That's beneficial for office work in general. Apple's AI models will be opened up to third-party developers. So especially if you want to run stuff on device, you don't want to use a server infrastructure of some kind. You want to advertise privacy and security for your app. Makes sense. Then you could be basically injecting your app workflow into whatever Apple AI tools are provided. There's live translation mode coming for Apple AirPods and the Siri voice assistant. Eye scrolling options for Vision Pro. Apple will be bringing new health features like a health assistant powered by AI and an AI-powered battery management mode. We've talked about a bidirectional Arabic and English keyboard with digital calligraphy pen for Apple Pencil users. So again, those are smaller things. I kind of would love for him to go into more details into stuff like what are the changes that align iPad and macOS more. But hey, we are only 1.5 weeks away from dub, so I guess it's good to still keep some surprises up in the air. And you guys are free, of course, to let me know, what do you think of this rebranding? Do you think it's a rebranding just for the sake of rebranding? Do you think it makes sense as I outlined because it does coincide with a redesign. It coincides with a more consistent approach to software design, which of course also makes sense to make the branding more consistent. Would you have preferred it at the very least if we got iOS 25 and macOS 25, for example, rather than 26, right? What do you think about the more car-like branding here? Yeah, let me know. Let me know here. Let me know in Discord. Let me know in Blue Sky. Let me know in Threads. So yeah, we can interact with each other in many different ways, grow the community, have a great dub together. And then, of course, later this year, we're looking forward to the iPhones, Macs, and stuff like that. Of course, for the iPhones, and I'll only mention it briefly, some people are speculating that it might mean we could get iPhones 26 this year, though this has not been corroborated in any way by any kind of major leaker. So it could happen. I personally, again, I am more inclined to say hardware at some point might lose the numbers, right? Like maybe after iPhone 17, we don't like get an iPhone 18 or something like that, but we just move forward to iPhone Air, iPhone E or SE, and iPhone Pro/Pro Max or Ultra, right? There's been also rumors that the Pro Max could be rebranded into an Ultra. Of course, there's also the question, what would they call an eventual iPhone Fold? Would that like become the Ultra? Because at that point it would become really complicated to like have really consistent branding, because now you would have an iPhone like 18 Fold, right, or 18 Fold Pro, right? I think the worst example is the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, right, where they try to brand the Fold as like a separate product, but then eventually they just said, oh my god, it's so cheap. I know it's used here, but like this is an 1,800 euro product by MSRP. Jesus Christ, it's really not selling too well. But yeah, instead of calling it like the Pixel Fold 2, as basically the successor to the Pixel Fold, they called it after the Pixel 9 generation, right, where it came out. They called it Pro for some reason. But I guess there's room now for a Pixel 9 Fold. But then at that point, they should have really called it the Pixel Fold Pro. But no, we got the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, which I think is currently probably the worst branded smartphone in the industry. Not that it ultimately matters too much. I think that Google's branding kind of overrides the terrible smartphone name. But yeah, it's just a very interesting thing to consider. So this is not everything we actually got from Mark Gurman. However, before I get to the other big piece of WWDC related changes that Mark Gurman has outlined, I would like to cover some smaller pieces of news. First, actually, does cover the macOS 26 release that we just discussed, and that is the support list of devices that will be getting this software. Supposedly, and this is coming from Apple Insider, calling this a very likely rumor. Okay. MacBook Pro 2019 or later will be supported. MacBook Airs, the only one supported, will be Apple Silicon devices. iMac will be supported 2020 and up. So basically, like the last version before we got Apple Silicon iMacs. That also finally leaves out the the iMac Pro. The Mac Pro will be supported with its last Intel cheese grater design. So that leaves, of course, Apple Silicon and still is some Intel there. Mac Mini, we are now leaving behind. I believe that we have already done that. No, I think there was a Mac Mini that was still supported, wasn't it? Like the 2018 or 19 version. Yeah, so the 2018 version would be left out. So now we're moving Mac Minis and MacBook Airs to Apple Silicon only. And of course, Mac Studio has always been Apple Silicon only. So that leaves out the 2018 MacBook Pros. It leaves out the last Intel generation of MacBook Airs, which are currently supported on Sequoia. The iMac Pro going back all the way, of course, to 2017, and the last Intel Mac Mini from 2018. And I honestly think, looking at this list, I'm inclined to believe that macOS 27 will be Apple Silicon only, right? So basically, the redesign will be like a last handshake to these devices. Like, think about it, there's like no 2020 Mac Pro or something like that. The iMac is already on the last year before we transition to Apple Silicon, right? It's same basically with the MacBook Pro, and already full on Apple Silicon only with Mac Mini, MacBook Air. Obviously, we got a new category only with Apple Silicon in the Mac Studio. So I think that Apple has been pretty aggressive actually in cutting older hardware from macOS than they even have been when it comes to iOS. And that's, of course, because of the bifurcation between Intel and Apple Silicon Macs. And not only is Apple just moving head on to like make everything Apple Silicon, I also wonder what even the internal expertise for like x86 development is these days. Like, I guess because they have pretty deep like hardware level control, they mostly can optimize on like a metal basis and shit like that. But I don't think that Apple is gonna refine that much what's left of the software for like x86 Macs. So yeah, that to me makes perfect sense. Obviously, they're not gonna partner with Intel in any way at this point, right, to get some help on this. Nor do I think that Intel cares about the chips in those devices anyway. At this point, Intel has also moved far beyond those older than 2020 like chip generations. So yeah, to me, it just would make sense. Like basically like one last hurrah, I guess, for Intel Macs. And then I also wonder if they will even run too well, given that I assume the redesign might be a little bit more system demanding. But now I'm really like thinking, oh, but then the next year they're really not gonna bother with that, which might actually leave those Intel Macs on a potentially buggy release. So keep that in mind before you update those way older Macs onto macOS 26, right? Because God knows, maybe Apple does not care enough about those Intel Macs anymore to make macOS 26 a really nice experience over there. But hey, those devices do support Boot Camp, so if you feel like you need at least some kind of always up-to-date software, you can move to Windows, or could even move to Linux. Well, I'm not even sure about Windows 11 because that one has its own requirements. So I guess there is still Linux for you guys. But hey, Linux has been getting a lot better in recent years as well. So that's one piece of small rumor, yeah. At this point, it's a leak or rumor. I always struggle to say things that are confirmed, because confirmed to me is something like our next discussion, like Apple expands Apple self-service repair support by including iPads. Now, it does not include too many new iPads. It includes the iPad Air M2 or later, the iPad Pro M4, the latest generation iPad Mini with the A17 Pro, and the A16 powered iPad. So that's interesting. Despite the hardware being so similar between the A14 and the A16 enabled iPads, it's only the A16 iPad that is getting official DIY repair support from Apple. And it includes components like displays, batteries, cameras, and external charging ports. Apple is also partnering with basically more repair services, or they're expanding their repair services here. So there's a genuine parts distributor program. Now, basically, you will be able to get those kinds of parts from more repair shops and stuff like that. I don't personally care too much about the do-it-yourself repairs, especially for Apple hardware, but I'm glad that they are definitely doing something, given that I think that the pressure from like right to repair advocates and even some regulatory agencies here in Europe, and it's been gaining some steam in the United States, is increasing. So, but what I also find funny about this, that while Apple is responding to this pressure, they've also quietly been like really good at actually embracing repairs. Now, they aren't making repairs necessarily like dirt cheap, which is like what I believe right to repair is technically mostly focused on, right? But when you think about when they redesigned the internals of the iPhone 14, right, so that you can open up it both from the front and the back and still have nice access to the battery, right? That was a big like design achievement, and even widely praised by like outlets like iFixit. And iPhones do not rank anywhere close to like the bottom of the rank as they used to when it comes to repairability scores anymore. So I think that Apple just quietly is like fixing those like shortcomings that people kind of associate with their technology without actually compromising that technology. Like, I think that the Pro iPhones are also a really good example of, over time, Apple will give you great battery life, right? From of course, when Apple was competing with like 4-inch display devices with like 5.5-inch display devices, of course, that small device would have low battery life. But even relatively, right, when you look, for example, at the 4.7-inch iPhones back in the day, they had pretty small batteries. They were somewhat outrageously thin for what they were trying to do. And they ran really hot, even with like an all aluminum chassis, which should be pretty good for heat dissipation. But yeah, over time, Apple kind of fixed that, right? Even just jumping from the iPhone 12 mini to the iPhone 13 mini, you get like a monumental upgrade in battery life. And now think about like where in the device like a 16 Pro Max sits. And now think about potentially that the big focus of the 17 Pro series is actually gonna be larger batteries, right? So Apple is willing to make devices thicker and even heavier to incorporate those components. So while again, this is not an Apple jerk-off channel, I've said it time and time again, there are still things that I believe Apple can improve even more, especially for the money that they're asking. And I also think that their focus on thinness and lightness on products like the iPad Pro makes no sense. If you were going to do it on some kind of iPad, do it on the iPad Air. Leave my iPad Pros alone. Give me a perfect like 6.9 to 7.5 millimeter thick iPad Pro. Give me phenomenal speakers inside there. Give me like a 70 watt hour battery for all I care, or at least like 60 or something like that. And I would be in heaven, right, with that kind of product. Give me a vapor chamber heatsink that goes across the entire product, right? Even it's a very thin layer, don't forget, it would directly distribute the heat towards an all-aluminum chassis. So that would pretty much double and triple the current cooling capabilities. We saw even how much Apple was able to achieve with like very small changes, right? Like the copper aluminum, the copper Apple logo, and like a slightly more advanced like graphite cover over the processor. Apple was able to like improve cooling by 20% in a product that got like 20% thinner, right? So imagine if Apple didn't focus that much on thinness, didn't focus that much on lightness. And again, it is a little bit of a controversial question because I actually like how light the iPads are. So technically, Apple just making them thicker wouldn't even make them really better. But I would accept at least like the 1.5 pound iPad Pros that we used to get. I know 1.3 pounds feels a lot nicer than 1.5 pounds. I know that because I had that same upgrade when I went from original iPad to an iPad 2. That was actually the exact same reduction in weight from 1.5 to 1 pound, 1.3 pounds, and it felt noticeably nicer in the hand. So again, nice changes to Apple's repair focus. Still, Apple still continues to make some questionable choices when it comes to the way they design their products. However, and this is something that I will always maintain, I think that Apple deserves to have the right to make those decisions. Now, I do not support making completely disposable hardware, right? And I think that that should be impacted by regulatory agencies. I think it should have penalties with them, right? But Apple does not make completely disposable technologies. That's because you cannot repair it. For one, doesn't mean that others cannot repair it. And just because a repair is sometimes expensive doesn't mean that it's impossible either. Nor does absolutely everything need to be like highly repairable. Like I think, for example, AirPods are a good example of like, honestly, as long as they are well constructed so they don't necessarily break easily, I do not need them to be highly repairable, right? Because after a time, like there will be improved technology anyway. There will be wear and tear on them. The battery will obviously degrade. Even the speakers might, and especially if like you shake them, you carry them around all the time, they will just get worse over time. So as long as they last 5 to 6 to hopefully even 7 or 8 years, I am fine with them after a while not being very usable. At that point, Apple should make sure they're nicely recyclable, something that has also been a big focus of Apple over the years by using, for example, highly recyclable materials like aluminum and glass, and especially like Apple is the absolute master of recycling aluminum. They've been some of the most innovative companies when it comes to that outside of like airplane makers, and even those focus more on like the premium nature of like aluminum rather than like utilizing every single gram in production that they have access to. So again, I'm not trying to suck Tim Apple off here, but I am trying to give you an insight into there are pretty good things happening in the world of Apple, and things that historically people have been like, oh my god, if Apple makes their hardware nicely repairable, I will instantly switched to them, right? And since then, Apple has actually made their devices way more repairable. Samsung has made their devices in many ways less repairable. But all those people who have screamed at Linus Tech Tips, Jerry Rig Everything, right? Did they jump from their main driver Samsungs or even other brands, which by the way, like Chinese brands are pretty bad when it comes to that kind of thing right now? Like, no, they didn't. They were always hypocritical. Like, I get it with somebody like what's his name? That right to repair YouTube guy who runs his own repair shop. Is it like Ross or whatever? Whatever, I don't care. I haven't watched his content in literally years at this point. I believe I covered him once for something on this channel, and ever since then, it's been like completely non-existent to me. Leave it in the chat if you know who I mean, right? Like that guy kind of doesn't like most big companies, which I get. I am friends with a lot of leftists, right? So don't get me wrong, but I feel like sometimes it's like irrational. Sometimes you're just starting to hate them for the sake of hating them. And I feel like Apple has changed so much and has listened to so much pressure over the last couple of years that to meet Apple with the same kind of vitriol that many of those people extended to Apple like a decade ago honestly doesn't make much sense. But hey, those people were never the most like intellectually honest in general. It's been always more of a fight of like the little guy versus the big behemoth company rather than actually benefiting consumers. And the reason why I say that, some will say, well, doesn't right to repair benefit consumers? Well, not really everyone. Most people don't want to do DIY repairs anyway. And instead of doing DIY, Apple has focused over years to expand their authorized resellers and repair shops, unlike any other company, to the point that a lot of times if you need or want some part of your iPhone or whatever to be fixed or replaced, like especially with batteries, you often don't even have to wait an entire day, right? You just go to that store, you leave it there. Usually it will be replaced in like 3 or 4 hours, sometimes quicker depending on if there's like a genius there, right? That's not a repair service that you will get with a Samsung device, for example, and certainly not with more obscure brands, even if they come from big companies like Google Pixel. For example, when you look at the Pixel 9a, right, out of nothing, right, Google launched a product. Oh, right, it wasn't iFixit that made it. But like Jerry of Everything just found out that the battery is like, it's basically like 6-7-year-old iPhone solutions, right, where it's like fully glued in and something like that. Not even talking about ease of access similar to like an iPhone 14 or whatever. And Google just randomly did it on like a product that did, like, they could have made this product like 1/10 of a millimeter thicker or something like that. Or like 0.5 millimeter if it really had to be, right? At that point, they could have actually maybe put in a better camera there. But yeah, and nobody cares, right? It gets its views, but does it create like constant backlash against Google the way that Apple suffered from constant backlash? Where's all the backlash for smartphones coming out consistently without SD card slots, without headphone jacks, right? Some people will say, well, Apple started it. And you were claiming that all of those choices would be like make those products less attractive. So why do people keep buying it? And companies are supposedly hurting themselves by copying those decisions. A lot of those companies don't even have the same successful like headphones business that Apple has with AirPods to benefit from like removing the headphone jack. But so yeah, again, this is the kind of nuance that I feel like just people refuse to engage in, and I hope that you guys see why I'm providing this. not to shit on others and not to elevate Apple, but just to show you the actual state of the industry. Because I am interested in all of this. I am interested in Google Pixel devices. I am interested in like the Chinese devices. I am interested in the criticism that Apple deservedly got over the years for smaller batteries, smaller cooling solutions, even like very small RAM pools. Like when you go back to like the iPhone 6 Plus having like 4 times less memory than certain competitive Android devices. But Apple has fixed most of them and has improved in other ways that most companies have not fully caught up to. Haptics, speakers, microphones. Again, and even like buttons, right? That historic weakness where Apple was being shit on for not having like a dedicated camera shutter button like Samsung, for example. Well, now Apple has that, while a lot of companies have either removed it or not just done it simply. And they even have a customizable button, and they have further customization accessibility features like the back tap gestures with double, triple tap options. And yeah, it just feels like some people are like on purpose like just not talking about all the changes that Apple has done, and they're treating Apple as if it's exactly the same as if it was like 8 to 10 years ago. Now, something that definitely was better 8 to 10 years ago, up until in comparison to up until yesterday, was the tariff situation. Man, what a segue. Basically, Trump wanted to levy extremely high tariffs on basically everything, right? From 10% across the board to like 30% on China and whatever. And I don't want to focus too much on politics. Basically, what you need to know is that the federal court for basically that's responsible for like international trade decisions on behalf of the United States blocked Trump's tariffs. Basically said that his Emergency Powers Act does not actually have the authorization to completely supersede Congress when it comes to setting duties, tariffs, taxes, and stuff like that. And that's what tariffs are. So Apple, I am sure, will now start importing a metric buttload of devices into the US. So if maybe if that decision is halted temporarily until Trump can appeal it first in an appeals court and then later in the Supreme Court, I'm almost inclined to say that there's a good path to Trump losing this across the board. And I'm also inclined to believe that this court will not grant him like temporary reprieve. I don't think they will pause this. If Trump had said like reasonable tariffs, or they were more targeted, let's say only towards China or whatever, I think that the court would have at least given him, okay, you know what, you can keep those tariffs up until the appeals court says something, and from that point on, it's basically up to the appeals court and to the Supreme Court, right? We don't like the tariffs, here's our statement, but you can keep them up until the appeals court has a different say, right? I don't actually think that. I think that Trump's tariffs are so unreasonable, so high, so targeted, especially against allies like the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and even emerging partners like Vietnam, right? Vietnam has been a huge bulwark against a lot of Chinese expansionism and aggression in Asia, and a big business partner for the United States. And I just find it hilarious that like Trump was allowed to enact like 54% tariffs against some of those countries until he had to lower them. And if you guys want to know what all of this is now being called, it's being called TACO, or Trump always chickens out. That's the way that first the business community has started to refer to his tariffs, and now basically every news agency uses that as well. And Trump is just absolutely losing his mind over that. So yeah, if you are in the US, feel free now to buy Apple products again without fear of well, maybe you're worried the tariffs might return soon, and then they will definitely come with some kind of price increase, especially we're really looking at like a consistent 20% tariff on India, 30% tariff on China or whatever. Yeah, but for now, to me, it looks like there's a good chance that none of those tariffs will come into play. If Trump wants to have some kind of tariff power, he will have to make it very case by case basis, similar to, for example, how Biden put a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, right? Because he said, oh, Chinese EV companies are being subsidized by the CCP. They're also hurting our own potential for battery technology development and factory building and stuff like that. They're also hurting our partners like Canada and Mexico. Riley, you're asking me, don't I think a price hike is coming anyways? Well, a price hike will come, but it will not be based on tariffs, hopefully, right? It should be noted that ever since the iPhone 10 in 2017, the build cost of iPhones has gradually been only increasing, right? There might be some individual years where it's been a bit more like questionable. Because some components, for example, like the iPhone 12 Pro had like a smaller battery than the 11 Pro, but simultaneously they also had 5G chips, which made them actually a lot more expensive, right? So there's always been some back and forth between like the cost of individual components and the overall product. I think that we will get price increases, but I hope that they will coincide with actual cost increases on the side of Apple, right? So, for example, when Apple increase the price of the iPhone 15 Pro Max versus the 14 Pro Max, the way they did it, they was get rid of the 128 gigabyte configuration and just start at 256. But that 256 gigabyte configuration came with the same price as the previous 14 Pro Max 256 gigabytes configuration. I could see Apple playing with stuff like for example, during the iPhone 7 Plus days, or during the iPhone 7 days, that jet black version was only available on higher storage configurations, right? So that one wasn't available on the base 32 gigabyte configuration. I could also see Apple playing around with offering even higher storage configurations, like 2 terabyte, which has been rumored for, I believe, about 2 years now. So I think that some form of price increase will be happening. But first of all, it's not going to be a one-time like 30% hike, which could have happened. Imagine if like the China tariff was actually ended up at like 150%. Apple had to mostly import their iPhones from India or Vietnam, at which point those countries would have faced like a 20 to a 50% tariff, right? So even if Apple completely avoids importing into the US iPhones from China, which, for example, for the iPhone Fold is rumored to be impossible for the first generation. Supposedly, the build process of the iPhone Fold is so complicated that Foxconn simply only has the needed personnel and tools in China, where obviously other companies have already been building foldables too. Right? So what would be then the price, for example, for the iPhone Fold in the United States if it's only manufacturable in China, at least maybe for like the first year or so? China faces anywhere from 30 to 154% tariffs, or 145, I always forget that. Right? So where would we have ended up? Don't forget that Apple wouldn't have simply tripled the price in the United States, then instead would have maybe increased the price in the US by 50%, but then they would have also increase the price outside of the United States to basically even it out a little bit. So I think a price increase is coming, but I honestly don't think it's going to be completely unreasonable. I think it's probably going to be like $100, and it might actually coincide with other value adds, right? If you look at the current, for example, let's just look at the Pro Max, right? 16 Pro. Let's try to buy it. Right, if you look at the 16 Pro Max here, it's $11.99 for 256 gigabytes. There are different color options, right? So imagine if, for example, if there was an exclusive color that only started once you chose 512 or 1 terabytes, right? Or let's say Apple increases the base price to $12.99, but actually makes it start with 512 gigabytes, right? Now, a lot of people don't need that much storage, but they kind of would be forced, right? But it would actually be a price reduction over this. Or let's say Apple gets rid of the 512 gigabyte option and kind of forces people into getting 1 terabytes. But maybe instead of pricing it at $15.99, well, it could be the 1 terabyte option stays at $15.99, but then the 256 gigabyte version starts at $12.99. So that one gets a bit more expensive, but actually the price jump from 256 to 1 terabyte actually is reduced. And some people might say, "Oh, that's too optimistic." You guys know which device I'll point out as like the counterpoint, right? The MacBook Air, the M4 version, starts at $9.99. The M3 version started at $10.99. And the M3 version initially came out with 8 gigabytes of RAM. So that's an effective $300 price reduction from the initial pricing of the 16 gigabyte M3 MacBook Air, right? Similar, I could see Apple, like for the MacBook Air future, I could see them not starting it at $9.99, but starting it at $10.99, but then also starting it with 512 gigabytes. Basically moving the average sales price up a little bit again, because Apple likes high average sales prices. But then this version might be a worse value after this, right? Because who knows what Apple will then charge for the fully enabled chip and just the faster charger and whatever. They could still ask like a $200 premium for this. Similar stupid shit they have done on the iMac over time. So again, I do see a price increase coming across everything over time. I mean, I believe Razer just increased prices. Granted, that was before the court decision on tariffs, but like I believe they increased most of their premium sale prices by like $300, right? So Razer Blade 18 laptop price jumps to $300. The 5090 is now $400 more expensive. Now, I believe that a lot of that will change with the new tariff situation, but it still is like this would have been the impact of even the short-term tariffs. That's not even considering the fact that maybe talks between China and the United States could have broken down, and then Trump would have enacted some crazy 200% tariff on China, for all we know, right? That was with 30% tariffs. So yeah, it's difficult to predict that stuff. But Apple has pretty sustainable, pretty high profit margins on their devices, and they know that they cannot just mindlessly increase prices left and right. They get backlash from the media. It can actually affect sales. We see, for example, that M4 sales supposedly have been way better than M3 due to the price reduction. So I think that Apple knows that some products have reached certain limits, whether it's $1,000 base for the MacBook, $1,200 base for the Pro Max iPhone or stuff like that. I think that Apple is smarter than people give them credit for. Like, and they haven't even done even the smallest price change based on tariffs thus far. They have changed prices in regions with very volatile currencies, but they always do that, right? Now, speaking of Apple being smart and Apple actually managing to sell their products well, before we get to the last piece of Mark Gurman news, I would like to cover this because to all the Apple doomed stuff people, to all the people saying, oh, Chinese companies, they're going to completely overtake Apple and whatever, like, uh, uh, it's not happening. And I'm not saying that Apple will not become proportionately less successful, right? New companies join the ring. They outgrow Apple in China, for example. But when it comes to worldwide demand, people forget Apple could lose ground in China, but then get a lot of that back in India. They're growing very nicely in India. They have more stores now in India. They have more partnerships with carriers. Indonesia, a 300 million people market, yes, a pretty low income market right now, but a pretty fast growing economy. And Apple is pretty nicely situated there. It's a luxury brand. Even if you can't afford Apple, you're looking at Apple largely favorably. So now, once that once that country grows more into the middle class, similar to what has happened in the last 25 years in China, Apple, and what's been happening in the last 10, 15 years in India, Apple will be getting those benefits. And we see on a worldwide basis, the iPhone 16 is the world's top selling smartphone, the iPhone 16 Pro Max being barely behind as the number 2 seller, the 16 Pro being right behind that. And then we have the last gen devices like the iPhone 15, which are obviously decently cheaper. Actually underselling these products by quite a good amount. And then still in the top 10, meaning Apple has 5 products in the top 10 selling category, is the iPhone 16 Plus. So this is where Apple obviously hopes to maybe get somewhere up to here with like a potential change from the Plus branding and the Plus category to switching to like the iPhone Air. Versus the previous years, some people have pointed out that the 15 Pro Max did outsell the iPhone 15, while this year the iPhone 16 outsold by a larger margin the 16 Pro Max. And while some people are saying that that basically means that the pros are becoming less important, kind of, then there's also the impact, of course, that the 16 Plus is actually less successful than the 15 Plus, which I believe when Apple initially started selling the 16th generation, it actually was looking a bit differently. So I think if you actually look combined at the 16 and 16 Plus and the 15 and 15 Plus, you'll actually find similar results. That being said, yes, the iPhone 16 is definitely more exciting versus the 16 Pro Max than the iPhone 15 was versus the 15 Pro Max, right? The iPhone 15 had a generation older chip than the 15 Pro Max. With it, less memory, no compatibility with like the latest AAA games that started to get ported to the 16 Pro Max. And it had a slightly controversial design with the diagonal camera arrangement, right? The 16 goes all out on vibrant colors, which is really important for a lot of people, especially if you're targeting more kids and teenagers and women, I guess. I don't like that distinction because I think men can like colors and fun as much as women, but I guess it is an overall truth. It has a design that's more like than the Pros now, right? With the dual camera pill arrangement. And it has the same generation processor as the 16 Pro. Yes, it's not a Pro chip. It's the A18 versus the A18 Pro, but it has the same amount of memory, Apple Silicon support for AAA games, right? So all those shortcomings that it has, like no ProMotion, no telephoto camera, no USB 3, right? Those things do matter, and they aren't bad, but they are definitely not the focus of most basic customers. VG is saying, why rebranding? Well, I can briefly go back to that. We did cover it right in the beginning of the stream, because yes, we are actually going back to Mark Gurman. And the honest answer is, for one, rebranding has been a little bit in the making for a while anyway, right? So now that we got to like iOS 18 and now 19 almost, right? The numbers are starting to look more ridiculous. The only way to give big numbers that don't look ridiculous is to align it with the year where this software will dominate, right? So iOS 26 will release in 2025, but will get most of its updates, most of its refinements, most of its rollout in 2026. Also, previously, in terms of consistency, right, we were at iOS 18, but simultaneously on like macOS 14, right? We were in visionOS 2, we were in watchOS 12. So instead of having all those disjointed version numbers coexisting simultaneously, now all of them will be easy to remember: 26, 26, 26, 26. And because consistency is a big part of iOS 26, macOS 26, right? There's a big redesign for all the systems, right? Initially, we thought it would be only for iOS. Then we found out it's also for macOS. Then recently, we found out it's also for watchOS and tvOS. So what was very interesting there is, of course, you kind of also want branding that reflects, first of all, there's a big change happening here, that redesign, but also all operating systems are getting it, right? So all of them simultaneously move up to a similar branding strategy. Now, you could argue between, would it be better to call it iOS 25 rather than 26? This is more car-like branding than what like Samsung does with the Galaxy S25 products, for example. But I do think it makes sense to do the rebranding. And I think that historically, something that Mark Gurman actually pointed out that I had forgotten myself is that, for example, iWork 08 and iLife 08 were introduced in August of 27. iLife 11 followed an October reveal or even on sale date of 2010, right? So Apple has historically adhered more to that car-like branding where you brand the car after the next year. So yeah, I think the rebranding makes sense. I also think it could mean some rebranding changes for the iPhone later down the line. We obviously already have iPad, Mac branding disconnected from like ever increasing numbers. And maybe at some point Apple says iPhone 17 should not turn into iPhone 18, but it turns into iPhone, iPhone Air, iPhone Pro, iPhone Ultra, right? And we just write the year in brackets next to it, similar to how we do it with Macs and iPads. Edge AI or hybrid Edge plus Cloud AI, worried about Apple AI Pay. It's different for different solutions, right? I don't understand, honestly, why people are worried about Apple's AI. You're not deprived of other AI options on Apple's platform, right? You can use ChatGPT, you can use Google Gemini, you can use even like Microsoft's Copilot if you are stupid enough for some reason, because it's just better to use ChatGPT regular. You can even have some, when you're on the Mac, you can even have a lot of the things run on device. You can have like Claude and that Chinese, I always forget what it's called, like the Chinese AI, right? There are apps where you can actually put the actual large language model inside it and just benefit, right? Now, granted, you won't have the same system level access with all of these tools. But like ChatGPT on Mac, for example, works really well. So my expectation is, or my own stance on this is, if you have a feature that's either trying something very extensive, right? Like think about the generative AI image stuff that led to all the Studio Ghibli images, right? I don't think if it's currently possible to run that on device unless we're looking like in a reasonable speed, unless we're looking at like the Max Studio with the M3 Max, with the M3 Ultra, with at least 256 or maybe 512 gigabytes, right? When it comes to basic text correction, right? I don't need that to run through a server. In fact, for privacy reasons, I would greatly prefer it to just stay on device and be available to me no matter whether I'm connected to Wi-Fi or 5G or if it's fast connection or slow, right? Similar to like if it's a search tool, right? If it's basically Google search, which Gemini is now directly integrated in, why would I need it to be offline? I'm already accessing something from the internet for this. So I have a very like hybrid approach, I guess. For example, a feature like photo cleanup, I actually like Google's approach here, where you have a local model, but you can have a more premium model from the cloud, right? Now for Apple, it will be primarily the model on device, but if you need a more advanced model, which I have used even myself for like generating certain thumbnails, I just install the Google Photos app for a moment, or I open it because I often have to installed, right? You don't even have to pay for a lot of the AI features in there. And then it does it because Google likes the data, right? They will basically give you a free service if they get basically to analyze that photo and stuff like that. So yeah, to me, it's a hybrid approach. And I'm personally not worried about Apple AI. I want them to take all the time they need. I have a very similar attitude towards this as I have with like game development. I don't like rushing like. Granted, GTA 6 is a little bit of a comical example with how long it's taking, but I would rather prefer they launch it on their own timeline in a way they actually feel comfortable with. I don't want Apple to invest in the same tens of billions of dollars into like server infrastructure if they're not gonna simultaneously do something like Google search, right? Google is just Google, and even Microsoft with Bing and their cooperation with ChatGPT is way better positioned to have those web-based AI stuff. And Apple should mostly, at least in my opinion, focus on on-device stuff. Any news on C1, C2 modem integration to MacBook? No, nothing new. There was rumors that by like C3, we would be like in the... like basically Apple might do it, right? So we know that Apple is waiting. For example, they don't see C1, CC, as being good enough for the iPhone Pros right now. So this year's iPhone Pros still come with Qualcomm modems. Also, they just have enough of them, so it wouldn't make sense to just like cancel their contract and pay all those penalties to Qualcomm. And then the year after, supposedly the iPhone 18 Pro and Pro Max will get like a C2 modem. I personally call it like C2 Pro because one of the major changes is also going to be millimeter wave support. And basically, the whole prediction was that C2 will be good enough in Apple's eyes for the iPad, for iPhone Pros, and then somewhere beyond that, whether we are talking about actually waiting for a C3 or just waiting for time to pass until after C2's launch, they could integrate it into Macs. The reason why Macs aren't like prime candidates for modems are also because macOS is not designed to be particularly uh, data saving, right? It's very much designed to be always connected to Wi-Fi or Ethernet. It has a lot of background tasks. Even the highly efficient devices and small devices like MacBook Airs are still designed to basically consume a lot of data when given access to. So if Apple put in the modem, they would also have to find a way to not make it consume that much data potentially. Maybe they're also waiting for a time when all carrier contracts are so generous that you can also easily put it on the Mac. I guess. But no, unfortunately, there haven't been more rumors about it. However, one thing that we have gotten more rumors about is actually more stuff from Mark Gurman here, and that is about a dedicated gaming app coming to basically to Apple's platforms. I guess it's first for iPhone, Mac, and Apple TV. It's kind of a successor to the Game Center app, which currently is basically integrated into stuff like settings and the App Store and obviously individual games. So it would be a bit of a revival for that. But simultaneously, it would also serve as a little bit of a successor to the gaming portion inside the App Store. So instead of having to go to the App Store for your games, and sometimes you go to gaming, sometimes to productivity and whatever, you would have an app completely focused on gaming. The games that are out on the store, Apple's own arcade service, which I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they expanded it in some way, but also that integrates all your achievements, your context, and stuff like that. So let's see how Mark Gurman is phrasing it. Apple is planning a dedicated app for video games on its devices, seeking to sell gamers and developers on the idea that it's a leader in the market. It should be important to note Apple is a leader in the market. The App Store is one of the, if not the largest gaming revenue generators on the planet. Right? When you think about, for example, of a mobile gaming revenue, right? It's larger than console and PC combined, and mobile gaming revenue is like notoriously kind of like a 2/3, 1/3 split between the App Store and the Google Play Store, right? There are some smaller players like the Epic Game Store and whatever, right? But it's really Apple that makes the largest amount of money through mobile app stores, and the biggest part of the App Store is gaming. So I guess subscriptions are also like very close to that. But the idea that Apple needs to convince people that it's a leader in the market is just not true. Now, Apple needs to convince AAA gamers and game developers that iPhone, iPad, Mac, and Apple TV are platforms worth targeting. We saw that with Apple's partnership, for example, with Square Enix, bringing out their Resident Evil games to iOS, iPads, Macs, right? We're seeing a lot more Mac games. High-end games like Control Ultimate Edition being ported, and supposedly there's a Cyberpunk 2077 port coming to Mac. Well, not supposedly, it's official, but we don't have a date, right? And obviously we have more and more games just piling up over time. Some stuff is on Steam, some stuff is on the Mac App Store, with the Mac App Store, in my opinion, being one of the more neglected pieces of Apple's like services. I think that for a while Apple just didn't think people would go to like an app store on Mac, and just so they basically made it because there was one on iPhone. But over time, they thought, you know what, most people are still gonna just like download their stuff from the web. But they see, for example, how successful Steam is on PC, and I think they want a piece of that pie. And obviously, Apple TV, it needs to be a lot more powerful to become a lot more relevant when it comes to gaming. but there is a chance that we would be getting like an A17 Pro or some kind of A18 based Apple TV this year. So who knows? The software will serve as a launcher for titles and centralize in-game achievements, leaderboards, communications, and other activities. I also hope that they integrated with stuff like Discord, so people could also automatically not just take like video calls and voice calls through Apple stuff like FaceTime, but also integrate with very popular solutions. There it is, Discord. The move is meant to enhance the experience on Apple devices at the time when gamers have plenty of alternatives. Should be noted that there was a time, and I still think it is, I think that Mark Gurman just doesn't understand it, that Apple was the alternative, right? iPhones were an alternative to game consoles or even to lightweight gaming on PC. It's not that Apple is now being supplanted by like cloud services and especially not consoles. Yes, the Nintendo Switch 1 is one of the most successful consoles of all time, but it's currently at under 150 million sales. That's what Apple sells annually when it comes to iPhones, right? And meanwhile, the PS5 is slightly under the PS4 generation, and the Xbox just dropped off a cliff. So overall, the current generation of consoles is about to actually sell slightly less than the generation before it. This to me is just so crazy that people are like, oh, first of all, cloud services are not a full-on alternative. The internet, especially outside internet, is still not good enough in most parts of the West. I also don't think it's getting particularly better when it comes to like fixing like actual like spots where you have almost no connection. We get like higher peak speeds and for uploads and downloads, and if you're in a good connectivity area, you get like lower latencies. But I still have like spots in the city where my connection is basically like 3G level at best. Sometimes it's more 2G and sometimes it drops off completely. And it's not based on my iPhone. I've been there with like Galaxies and stuff like that from friends. So it's literally just this bad here in Germany. The Nintendo Switch 2 is not like the main competitor to the gaming on iPhones and iPads. I guess this is one thing that I bring up, and I will bring it up again, is that Mark Gurman tries to always bring up competitors. But fact of the matter is that making gaming more relevant on Apple's own devices, for one, I believe that the new generation of executives is a little bit more friendly towards gaming. Steve Jobs was notoriously like pretty anti-gaming. Phil Schiller wasn't the greatest gaming fan from what I understand. Tim is not a gamer himself, but obviously Tim is not the face of the company in quite the same way that Steve used to be. So plus Apple did try gaming, but then notoriously bad stuff happened. For example, when you look at when you look at them partnering with Bungie to bring Halo to the Mac, right? And first, right? It's not like they weren't a port from Bungie, but then Microsoft swooped in and basically bought Halo for themselves. Ever since then, Apple had their big falling out with companies like the Epic or Epic Games, right? Which for one wants to put their own Epic Game Store on Apple's devices and deprive Apple of their commission that they like to collect from third parties. But even with them, they also have like very inconsistent partnerships. Like they work deeply with them together on stuff like bringing the Infinity Blade games to iPhone, which were huge back in the day. And Fortnite was actually first shown, I believe one of its first showing was at the WWDC. It was a slightly different concept than what it ultimately ended up being, but it was very close to that. But then ultimately on the Mac, it kind of wasn't like a thing, right? So sure, it was a good thing on iPhone and iPad, and that's where Apple likes their revenue. But if you think about a cohesive gaming platform between iPhone, iPad, Mac, and potentially Apple TV, like Apple really has had bad experience with game developers, game publishers, and so growing, especially their footprint in the AAA gaming industry, is not about supplanting like competitors. Apple isn't even yet in that gaming market. But I guess, for example, to grow even small gaming on Mac, there are things that I believe should be on the App Store, but simply aren't. For example, Vampire Survivors is both on Apple Arcade and a regular game on the iPhone and iPad App Store, right? But then on Mac, it only exists on Steam. It's not part of Apple Arcade for Mac. It's not a regular game that you can buy on the Mac App Store that's fully compatible with your iPhone, right? So to play Vampire Survivors, I had to buy it on the Steam app on Mac. Right? And it's crazy because the Steam app on Mac isn't even Apple Silicon optimized. It's still an Intel based application. But then Vampire Survivors is an Apple Silicon optimized game, and it runs extremely well, easily reaches 120 frames per second at native display resolution. And the other game that I play a lot on my Mac is Dave the Diver. Yeah, that's what it's called. And it's a great game, right? And it's a very easy to run game that at least could have come to like M1 iPads, but it's not even on the Mac App Store. It's only on Steam again. So I played this game a lot on my PlayStation. I got it through like a PlayStation Plus month, right? Whatever. But then I had to buy it on the Steam app on the Mac. Right, which I wouldn't like to do that. I would prefer to buy it over the Mac App Store. Much better, especially if it meant some kind of compatibility with my iPad and iPhone. Yeah, I would greatly prefer it. So maybe having some kind of gaming app that, for one, shows, oh, there is a bigger focus on gaming. Also, it might be a platform where Apple might want to avoid some of the regulatory pressure that the App Store faces. Apple could say, "Look, we are allowing third-party stores in the EU, so we also made one extra store of our own. You cannot complain about that." Even though I guess the European Union will still find a way to complain. Yeah. So again, it's not. I'm not trying to shit on Mark Gurman here, but I do think whenever he brings up like the competitors, I don't honestly think he has the needed understanding of the competition to do that. Like the Nintendo Switch 2 is not more or less of a competitor to Apple's gaming market than the Nintendo Switch already was. The new app will feature editorial content from Apple. That's important because obviously if you open up the regular App Store, there is only so much room for Apple to say, here's an ad for once, right? And here are like 2 or 3 apps, games that we deem are like worth downloading, right? Potentially even worth paying money for. That way, I guess they can focus their editorial content on the App Store, primarily on apps, right? Everything from content consumption apps, productivity apps, even office apps or whatever, right? But then financing apps, all basically everything that's not gaming. And then inside the gaming app, that editorial content would be gaming only, which does make sense. And it could also be much more detailed. So it could be focused on like a DLC for a game, or even some kind of new cosmetic that's inside the latest multiplayer game, right? It wouldn't have to be much more broader, which I guess would be needed for the App Store. And it could also be much more targeted towards you. If Apple really focuses on all like your personal stuff regarding gaming, including leaderboards, communications, in-game achievements, all your gaming activity. Maybe it could even start showing you, like Steam, how many hours you have spent in the game and stuff like that, right? that to me would then also allow not only for editorial content that's, oh, Apple likes something, oh, it's something new, but it could also be much more specific, oh, it's something you might like. It will also offer access to the App Store game section. Makes sense. It will promote arcades. This is currently a $7 a month subscription from Apple. I really like it, especially since it has a strong family component. So my nieces are accessing my Apple Arcade through Apple One. So that makes a lot of sense. If they really wanted to offer AAA gaming or cloud gaming as part of this, I assume they would increase prices, but we'll have to see. It will replace Game Center, an existing social network dedicated to this category. It never really gained too much traction. That is absolutely true. Apple is also planning a Mac version. That's very important because if you go to your Mac App Store right now, there are two kind of gaming related sections of the app. One is Apple Arcade and one is called Play. And it's horribly organized, partially because there isn't even that much content on it. I guess once you include, of course, all the games that are compatible with Apple Silicon Macs because they are iPad apps, there's a decent amount, but Apple primarily tries to show you stuff that is Mac first. So I guess if they make a Mac gaming app, there could be a section just like iPad apps that will work great, right? That's currently a feature inside the Mac App Store, but it requires like multiple taps to get into that. Instead, here, it could be right front and center. Again, what I am saying is speculation, and you guys can let me know what are the features you would like to see being implemented in such a gaming app. But I think that those are good opportunities. There are people, I don't know if he posted a video. I guess he posted on Blue Sky. No, he hasn't. But Snazzy basically posted on Blue Sky saying it's like an admirable effort from Apple that they're trying to do this. I guess I can look into this. There's nothing too private here from myself. Snazzy. Yeah, Quinn Nelson. Samsung TV, blah, blah, blah. 4 days ago. Is IO a boy or a girl? Okay, that's funny. Wait, was it not Quinn? Was it somebody else? Did he post it somewhere else? Or was it just somebody with a very similar name? Or did he post it on Threads? Because I don't have actually my login for my new Threads on my Mac. Jesus. Okay, I'll just tell you what I remember. Because the crux of the story was basically very simple, and that is that he is saying that an own Apple gaming app is not the solution to Apple's woes in the gaming industry, but instead they should be partnering with Steam. They should be working on their compatibility and translation tools for Windows games, right? D3D Metal and stuff like that. Molten VK, right? All that stuff for like DX12 compatibility, Vulkan compatibility, direct translation from Windows, like integration with tools like Vine, right? Basically make it more of their own Proton, which is how Valve deals with Windows games running on Steam Deck. The problem with that is that ultimately it would just create on yet another platform for Steam to sell games on. And I'm not entirely against that, but Apple cannot really rely on Valve too much here. Valve is a small company that really likes to prioritize, and obviously their biggest priority is gaming on Windows, and after that it's their own Linux platform with the Steam Deck running it, and now a few other hardware devices as well. Handhelds. But like if Apple comes in, so Apple would have to pay Steam to finally make their Steam client, like for example, native on Apple Silicon, and maybe having a Mac dedicated section on it, which it technically has, but again, it requires way too many steps to get into it. Maybe at some point I'll show you that. I'll find a way to show you my App Store, my Steam, without showing you like my email address and my full name, because those always come up. But I'll do like screenshots and edit them, I guess. I guess I found the solution right now. But so Apple would be paying money to make sure that Windows apps run better on Mac. Now, ideally, it would mean that more of them would also be ported, and maybe some of them could like trickle down to the Mac App Store. But we already see that that's not really happening. Again, like the two games that I play most from Steam could easily be on the Mac App Store. One of them even is on the iPhone and iPad App Store. It's even part of Apple Arcade, but the developers still couldn't find it in them to have Vampire Survivors at least as like a separate game sold on the Mac App Store. I know it would require a few tweaks here and there, right? Basically integration with the Games Center rather than integration with like the Steam data collection stuff. I know it wouldn't be just a one-to-one port from what's on Steam to what would be on the Mac App Store, but it would be so easy. And especially like you already have an iPhone app, please allow me to, and an iPad app, please allow me to install it on my Mac. Plenty of games allow me to download the iPad version on my Mac. Why don't all of them, right? Now, some of them I can somewhat understand. Maybe they have a dedicated version on the Mac, or they're at least working on it. Like Prince of Persia, right? Prince of Persia has an iPhone/iPad app, but then they have a dedicated Mac app, right? Those ports were done at different times. They also took different amounts of effort, right? So you kind of have to pay double if you really want Prince of Persia on both your Mac and your iPhone. I don't like that. I think that's actually a missed opportunity. I think being a bit too greedy here is hurting Ubisoft. But I guess that's also nothing new when it comes to Ubisoft. But it's a fantastic game, right? I play it on my PlayStation regularly. But I'm just trying to say, asking Apple to just be a better platform for Steam, for one, that's not really Apple. Even if you ignore the money-making aspect, Apple likes their own solutions, right? Even before they launched the App Store on the iPhone, it's not like they allowed you third-party app stores before it. In fact, Steve was vehemently against any kind of store in the beginning. He wanted the iPhone to primarily run from web apps. And those wouldn't actually make Apple too much money. They would be mostly free, and some of them, I guess, would be paying for through the web, right? So Apple wouldn't necessarily be able to charge anything for it. And that was fine with Apple because they thought, oh, you know what? Our hardware is so weak anyway right now. What kind of apps will come to it? But once they started improving the iPhone, right, they were like, oh, we're just about to launch an iPhone with 3G. And the year after that, we're launching an iPhone with like double the processing speed. Let's make a store for all of this. Obviously, all of this has also started development a little bit sooner. But the same, all I'm saying is the truth. Right. So basically, Steve's idea about non-app store for the iPhone kind of predicts the original iPhone announcement, right? Somewhere around when the original iPhone was introduced, Apple already started working on the App Store. So it didn't just like in a week materialize on the iPhone 3G. But it's a complicated thing where Apple likes money. And yes, you can even call Apple greedy and whatever. But having their own dedicated controlled apps and features, does make sense. I mean, for example, Apple Silicon Macs are getting so much more market share these days. Now they have so much more RAM. They've even gotten cheaper, right? The customer satisfaction on them is actually incredibly high. They actually have some of the best integrated graphics. They're still better than like the HX 370 from AMD that actually launched launched around the same time as the M4, a bit before it, but it also consumes way more energy, right? And it's actually, I believe the M3 is still more powerful than it, especially when it comes to features like ray tracing. So all I'm saying is, even in all of this, Steam or Valve just cannot be bothered to bring a native Apple Silicon Steam client to the Mac, even with all of those things that are being improved. So why shouldn't Apple try to do it by themselves rather than bagging Daddy, what is his name? Valve CEO Dave Newell? Valve CEO? Gabe Newell. Right. I love the new look for him, by the way. For one, he lost weight. I believe he's thinner than in this photo, but like that beard is badass. So I don't have a problem with him. But he clearly is not the greatest fan of like forcing his engineers to make better solutions for macOS. And obviously, there's still a question if third-party stores will even be mandated for Apple in in the United States or in China, right? Which, if they aren't there, Valve isn't trying to bring Steam to just the European Union, at least from what it looks right now. So, again, all of this gets a little bit rambly because everyone has different opinions here. I know that a lot of us want a better, especially AAA gaming experience, or everything from the iPhone to the Mac. But it's not as simple as asking Apple, please make Steam better on Mac. Benveni, what do you think Apple will change the iPhone name lineup to? I think it would be better to change it into 2027 and name it like the iPhone's 20th anniversary. Yes, for one, I do not think, I do not believe that there will be an iPhone rebranding this year. Next year, it's a bit more questionable. I guess we'll start hearing about it. But yeah, 2027 to me makes sense, especially if this is actually the year where we are getting like that big redesign. However, the reason why I could believe it might happen next year is because of the foldable iPhone, right? The first gen iPhone Fold is rumored for late 2026. Potentially early 2027. And we are rumored to be getting the Pro iPhones first, right? So the iPhone 18 Pro and 18 Pro Max would basically come out in September of 2026. But then the base model and I'm not sure, but no, the Air also will be in September. But then the base model and the E model will come in early 2027, right? Maybe that will also justify that change, right? So you do have a brand new model like the Fold, and you have a new release schedule. That to me could also justify it. Now, what do I think Apple will change it to? Honestly, it's an even better question. But what does Apple officially refer to like their Macs and stuff like that? They do not call it like the M4 MacBook Pro. That's just what we call it in like the nerd community, right? Jesus. What? Sorry, I sometimes halfway look on my iPad, so I misclick shit on my Mac. Apple M4 MacBook Pro Wiki. What's the official model name? Apple M4. No, that's the chip. The Apple Wiki. Yeah, that's what they call it, right? 16-inch, November 2024, right? Now, on the iPhone, I don't assume that Apple will make change naming nomenclature based on display sizes. I think that if there is an iPhone Pro that's 6.3 inches, then we will either have a Pro Max or an Ultra iPhone with 16.9. And then I think it just in brackets will say November or September 2025 or 2026, whatever. Actually, I think they'll start calling by the chipset. The problem with that is it's a little bit too nerdy. It's also not always beneficial to every product, right? Some products it will get confusing because you have products based on the Pro variant and the Max variant, right? You also have potentially bad branding. Like, what's for example, what's the branding for the Mac Studio right now? Mac Studio. So Mac Studio, the 2025 version, please. Mac Studio 2025. What is it named after? It has the product type, but then afterwards it just has the year, right? Because calling it M4 Max and M3 Ultra, right? While yes, technically that is correct, but even between them, there are differences, right? You can have different configurations of the M4 Max and of the M3 Ultra. You can have different RAM and storage configurations. So it's not like you're just going to list the entire spec sheet with the processor name, right? So I guess these kind of like product type names plus the board configuration shit, that is not gonna be the official naming at all. I could see the year being there. Yeah, for the iPhone, obviously, I do understand why why you think, why you thought, if I didn't convince you otherwise yet, why it could work on the iPhone, and that's because the iPhones have much less complicated chipset situations, right? Of course, but then again, now we would have two different iPhone models based on an A blah 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 chip and an A blah 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 Pro chip, right? So that's already a bit because now you have different versions in terms of size on there. And now once you include the Fold, now you would also have an iPhone Fold blah 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 chip, right? And I think that gets a bit too nerdy to know like the suffix of the actual like product, right? Like the reason why I think Air, like the iPhone Air branding makes a lot of sense is not because it's simply a thin iPhone and whatever, right? I think for the same reason why I believe MacBook Air makes a lot of sense, even though it isn't chasing the thinnest and lightest laptops the way it used to. The reason why I think iPad Air makes sense as a branding, even though Apple for a while has made the Pro kind of more impressive in that regard, especially with the M4 version. But I think that basically just having Air as their mid-range devices, Pros, and maybe in some ways Ultras, if you look at like the Apple Watch and stuff like that, for their premium models. And then you have a non-branded version, like the basic iPad, right? That one is... What's the iPad actually branded? I believe the iPad is actually branded after the chip partially now, but only for the base version, right? So you get the generation branding, the display variants, but then iPad A16. Okay, no, they still refer to iPad 10th generation, but different variants. Oh, Jesus, that's very complicated now. Oh, yeah, that should be avoided, in my opinion. Like, this is also where calling it after a generation is a little bit confusing, because what is the cutoff point from one generation to the next? Is a chip swap enough, right? Even though the entire rest of the hardware is the same. It's complicated. WG, the ecosystem timing and drives just limited Mac game market. As you said, that's really long story to take. Why game market fails? I don't think the Mac game market fails still. I think it failed in the past, and I think it's still suffering from that failure, right? Because it takes time, it takes money, and it all honestly more so than market share, it takes mind share to bring people. Yes, I do believe that RAM for a while was an issue on Macs. Now it's basically completely fixed. Especially if you are willing to target M4 and upwards. For smaller games, I think storage is enough. Like obviously, Dave the Diver, Vampire Diaries, Vampire Survivors that I play, they fit fine. Or they would fit fine even on a 256 gigabyte device. But yeah, for also other for like AAA games, like Cyberpunk is over 100 gigabytes and stuff like that, especially with its highest quality textures. Now you're really limited by still the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air, the passive cooling is a bit of an issue when it comes to performance, but it's not terrible because its performance is so good. Losing like 30 to 40% of its components is actually not a death penalty for a game. But I think the next thing that Apple needs to solve is the storage. And I think that 512 gigabytes will be plenty because the true AAA gamers, the true enthusiasts, will get 1, 2, or even higher terabyte configurations anyway. But once you give the base consumer half a terabyte under their fingertips, I think that they will download a lot more games and a lot larger games without worrying too much about it. iOS gaming success is the door open for Mac game failures, true. And of course, it's not just the success, the mind share, the money that comes with iOS. It's also literally the development tools. And now that Apple Silicon Macs share a development environment with iPhones and iPads. Now, partially, developers don't like being taken away the option to charge you twice, but I guess they don't do that on Steam either, right? Granted, Steam is not on phones and not on lightweight tablets, but for example, if I play on my big PC tower, I still can download the same Steam game at no extra purchase on my handheld Steam Deck, right? So, and I hope that Apple would actually require that from more and more developers. And at least they should, like, I am all for Apple investing money into this. AAA game ports, helping with switching big engines, maybe not Unreal Engine, but who knows, to be very Mac friendly, right? Teaching developers how to better work with Metal and shit like that. Of course, further improving stuff like their translation tools, but those should be a gateway to bring a Windows game to an official store. They shouldn't force you to download a Windows-based, basically an .exe file, and then make you hope that with those translation tools, they also run on Mac. Especially since that will also vary from like the generation of Mac you have, how old that game is. So it's not like I would much more prefer fully native games. One thing, for example, Witcher 1 and 2 Mac, right? So Witcher 1 and 2 have native Apple Silicon versions on the Steam app for macOS, right? But they are very, very basic ports, right? The entire underlying app is basically written in old APIs and tools that have no, like they didn't even dream of Apple Silicon when they were created. And because a lot of it is still like translated, you can see they're terribly reviewed. And I just bought The Witcher 1 through Steam because it was like €1.79. And that game just crashed after like 15 minutes of play. So and it doesn't even, like, for some reason, it doesn't even fully allow me to target the resolution of my Mac panel. It maxes out at like 1440p, which I guess is enough, but it's still like there would be like another 500 pixels on each side to go. So lazy ports and forcing stuff through translation layers really is not what Apple wants. And yes, to force higher quality ports, and especially to bring them to the Mac App Store or that new Mac gaming app, will take money, will take time, but I would much prefer for Apple to keep working on their current approach, which was like the Resident Evil games and Assassin's Creed Shadows, right? All that stuff that's already made their ways to iPhones, iPads, Macs, and future stuff like Cyberpunk. So there is more to be done, and Apple is seemingly doing some of it. Like Apple acquired Rack 7 Games, the developers of Sneaky Sasquatch. It should be noted, though, that this is a two-person studio, so maybe Apple will allow them to hire a lot more people or stuff like that. I could also see those people, instead of developing games for Apple, but maybe help Apple work on their tools. So maybe Apple found, oh, these people are not just actually good game developers, but they actually understand the Metal API very well and stuff like that, Metal FX. So maybe we can hire their company to just bring them on board. So I'm not saying Sneaky Sasquatch 2 will be an internally developed Apple title at this point. But yeah, also, like, of course, the iPhone is already one of the world's most used gaming devices. So it's not like Apple has to entirely prove themselves from like 0 to 100. They have a pretty big entry point into the gaming market already, even a little bit into the AAA gaming market already. So they now just have to improve upon that. In fact, I do believe that the next wave that Apple should focus on is not super basic iPhone apps on Mac. I don't think even it's AAA games, though they should be a continued focus. I think it should be indie games, stuff like Hades, right? Or even like one of my favorite indie games on PlayStation, Kenna, Bridge of Spirits. That game is a bit demanding. It's an Unreal Engine 4 title, but it could run very well at this point, from everything from the M1 Pro to especially even like the M4 generation. So similar to how the Switch actually got a lot of its early successes from a lot of indie ports, right? Because AAA games simply didn't run too well on the Switch. I think that should be a focus from Apple. They should reach out to those kinds of smaller developers, make them more familiar with the way you develop games for Macs. I think that Apple should work with porting studios like Feral Interactive. Like, I wouldn't mind if Apple bought Feral Interactive, right? Is Feral Interactive up for grabs? Who owns them currently? Feral Interactive. So they're primarily like a port maker. They even list macOS as first, so that should be telling you something, right? Feral Interactive is a British video publisher. Yeah, they should be. They should be up for grabs. They have 100 to 150 people. Apple should keep buying smaller developers like those two guys that make Sassy's. I wanted to say Suburban Sasquatch, but that's something entirely different. It is Sassy Sasquatch, right? Yeah, it's Sneaky Sasquatch. Jesus. But I think those guys could be a big help, right? Take them away from making Linux and switch ports and just give them a nice amounts of money and make sure that they keep on, or not only do they keep making ports, but they should also, in my opinion, keep publishing best development practices for other developers and gaming publishers to adopt. WG, from source code perspective, how do iPadOS, iOS, tvOS, macOS differentiate with each other? Are they sharing unified function models since they're all on ARM? Yes. They have differences that basically automatically come into play when it comes to like display size, the direct or indirect interactive methods, like whether you're using like fingers, of course, on multi-touch, or your mouse. And technically, you can make those apps still very distinct in some ways, but that's a bit more effort. But you don't have to. You can make a very distinct app, very separate, like what I mentioned for Prince of Persia, right? That one is actually pretty different from its iPhone to its Mac app, even though they are ARM, metal based, right? All that stuff that makes up Apple's gaming baseline. But then you have games that basically are like, oh, look, I'm on a device with a different aspect ratio screen, a larger screen, different resolution, different input options. But also, when you think, for example, like an input option, like a controller, right? That one then makes a game behave almost exactly the same on iPhone as it does on iPad. Then there can be specific implementations, like for example, the iPhone and iPad version of a AAA game might be a lot smaller than the Mac version, even though the code is incredibly similar, right? But the main difference will be that the iPhones won't feature the same high quality texture pack as the Mac version does, right? Because for one, it would take up more space. It will take up memory that the iPhone doesn't even really have, and it would potentially consume more energy, which is not an experience that Apple wants for the iPhone. So yeah, but otherwise they're incredible. I couldn't tell you where the differences exactly are. It's been a while since I read up on that when Apple launched the Apple Silicon Macs, and they had like a big explainer videos at DubDub and stuff like that. But you can look into that. I would be actually fascinated if you could provide some insight into that in future videos if you decide to join us again. Guys, that's about it for today. Let me briefly check if there's anything that I have missed. Jesus, I cannot type anymore. Base iPhone 17. Wait, what? Okay. That's something that okay, that's gonna be the last rumor we're gonna be discussing today, because I didn't expect it to happen here. Is that completely new, or is that just them bringing up an older? Because they're saying again rumored. Apple has big changes planned for the iPhone 17 lineup, headlined by the addition of the all-new iPhone 17 Air. The 16 Pro and Pro Max got larger screens, going from 6.1 and 6.7 to 6.3 and 6.9 inches respectively. The Plus model now becomes the Air. Supposedly that one is like a 6.56-inch display or something like that. According to a new subscriber post from reliable analyst Ross Young, the iPhone 17 will feature the same size screen as the iPhone 17 Pro, so that's larger now. Which we note, for example, that the both the iPhone base model and the iPhone Air are getting promotion. But that to me suggests that Apple could just give the exact same M14 premium. This, because what else? Like, do you think Apple would just go to Samsung and say, look, we want a 6.3-inch ProMotion screen, but make it just like a bit worse than the one that we have already ordered in mass from you? No, I would be shocked if this wasn't the exact same panel. Like, if it were 6.1 inches, my first bet would be it would be the exact same panel as in the iPhone 15 Pro series, right? That makes sense. It's a little bit less like advanced in terms of like color reproduction and brightness than the 16 Pro. It's like 5 to 10% less energy efficient. It's really negligible differences, but it is cheaper, and it is a production line that Apple could basically go to Samsung for, to LG for, and say, look, you made the 15 Pro displays, make basically that again. But knowing that it's going to be potentially, and Ross Young is pretty much like the guy I trust the most, because he has a very narrow focus. He only focuses on displays. So yeah, that would be cool. A ProMotion 6.3-inch screen. That also now makes me wonder what's going to be the bezel size. Are they going to do basically what they did from the 15 Pro to the 16 Pro, which is maintain most of the same like chassis size, but have basically a larger screen? With slim bezels, like some of the slimmest bezels in the industry? Or would they roughly keep the same bezels as on the previous gen and make the device a bit larger for that? Damn, that's an interesting one. Didn't actually expect to be covering this. Riley, 120 hertz on all products would fix most of my problems. Well, that is definitely happening. But also, my idea here is honestly, if this is 6.3 inches, right? And think about it, it's a thicker product, potentially a larger battery capacity than the 17 Air, right? What point would be in a 6.6-ish inch iPhone 17 Air if the base model gives you better battery life, dual cameras, potentially better processor cooling, maybe it gives you a little bit less RAM or something like that, but it gives you almost the exact same display size, but then just a better experience and so much else for potentially less amount of money. I'm just flabbergasted because between 6.1 inches and 6.6 inches, there's a decent difference in the end experience. But between 6.3 and 6.6, not really. If they at least gave it the same, if at least they gave the Air the same 6.7 inches as they did in the past, and definitely if they gave it the 6.9 inches of the Pro Max, that would make sense. But now, I don't know. I don't know why Apple doesn't delay it until a decent battery is available. That's interesting because we had one rumor saying it would have a 2800 milliamp hour capacity, but then other rumors before that said it would be a higher density battery. Now, it remains to be seen because don't forget, Apple is not trying to compromise the 17 Air in all ways, right? I mean, for example, one thing that surprised me about it was that it would have MagSafe, because MagSafe literally takes up a little bit of extra space for thickness that could be dedicated to just a larger battery. Right? So, in fact, I almost wondered why do they not make the Air like a cheap model, right? Kind of like more of like a 16E Plus. But yeah, I agree that it should be like my baseline in my head was always like, if they really manage a super efficient screen and the C1 modem just blows our mind somehow more than it did in the 16E, maybe 3300, yeah, but like 2800 is definitely not acceptable for a screen that size. And now with a 6.3-inch base model, honestly, we just looked into the like the share of iPhone sales between models. Honestly, I think this could make the base 17 once again the most successful model, even by a bigger amount. Even if Apple really improves the pros and gives it an even better battery or whatever, having ProMotion and a larger screen here on the base model is probably all most people care about. And it would basically combine what currently is iPhone 16 and 16 Plus sales into potentially one model, plus a little bit of trickle-down effect to the Air. If it means waiting for silicon batteries, so be it. Again, I actually do believe that the iPhone Air might have silicon carbon batteries. But don't forget, silicon carbon batteries are roughly 15% more energy dense, right? Maybe some of there you can argue 20%, but think about what that means, right? If let's say with completely conventional technology, you can fit 2500 milliamp hours, right? That means at best you now get to put in 3000. the iPhone is just so thin unless Apple makes the glass, for example, super thin, which they won't because it will make the product less durable. Think about it. If you have a 5.5 millimeter thick device, think about what that means for the actual internal space, because you have a display that also needs like a cooling layer and stuff like that. Then you have your back glass, which also needs like to be decently thick to be durable. So that leaves like 60% less space for a battery. That's just a completely made up number, but I guess what you mean. For Apple, 700 milliamp hours is a lot. Yeah, it would make a big difference. I'm not arguing against that. Is silicon battery safe after time? It's difficult to tell. I wouldn't say it's less safe. From everything we understand, it is like less explosive, for example, than lithium ion traditional. The only downside that I've seen some people discuss is that silicon carbon batteries could degrade faster than traditional chemistries. But consider that, right? If you get 15% more capacity in the same volumetric space, and let's say that battery degrades 10% faster, that still gives you more capacity after 10 years, right? I don't think it will degrade like twice as fast, right? But that is like a downside that we find in a lot of density discussions. For example, lithium iron phosphate, which is used in a lot of electric vehicles, is notorious for having lower density, but it's way more safe and it's way longer lasting because iron is just, I guess, durable, whether it's in ionic form or if it's like just like a big part of like your car chassis. And seemingly in the last few years, we have solved a lot of the compromises of higher density batteries, degrading faster. Also, silicon carbon seems to charge faster, which I guess even if your battery at some point is more degraded, that at least gives you some plus points even after years of ownership. But yeah, it's not a bad technology by any means. It's not a full-on compromise, right? I feel like that's what a lot, like when a lot of people bring up like innovation that Apple is lacking, I always find that some of it is way more compromised than people want to admit. Even something like a full 1-inch sensor, right? That does have some negative impact on the focal distance or on some edge-to-edge sharpness, right? It gives you great bokeh depth of field and potentially great like low light performance, right? But if it only can focus on parts of your face because it has such a shallow depth of field, then it's not really that useful. I mean, it's going to be great for panoramic photos, but a lot of what people use smartphone cameras for is capturing people stuff, right? And so there are a lot of like potential compromises, and I think that silicon carbon makes those compromises in a smart way, right? It's denser, it's faster charging, it's safer, and for all of that, it potentially just gives up percentage-wise longevity. But then again, if you start with a higher battery capacity, you can actually afford to lose more capacity quicker. But we will see over time how exactly that plays out. We have seen Apple experiment with a lot of battery-related stuff, right? For one, it's that electricity-based adhesive, right? So instead of having glue, you basically can connect a current to it, and it pops off the battery, right? So that was seemingly is one of the most repair-friendly. Now, granted, it does require you to have an extra tool, but it requires you to way less fiddle around and potentially poke your fucking battery. AETW, will there be iPhone 17 Air? Yes. I would be shocked at this point if, like, who knows, maybe it gets canceled last minute, but I will be honest, if they really give the base model a larger display, I think the Air will be a harder sell than I even thought it could be. Guys, we're almost 2.5 hours into it. I guess I will not be streaming tomorrow to just like preserve my voice. But yeah, thank you so much for joining. Last chance for you to have a message for me to respond to. Make it a super chat if you can. Of course, last shout out to do the YouTube jazz, subscribing to the channel, liking the video, sharing it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it. And please consider joining my Discord and stuff like that. I posted this on the channel, and don't just comment in the live chat, but we have like 3 or 4 people who are very active posters in the regular chat, because they often don't have time to watch live. But then those of you who watch live, don't comment in the regular comment section. It would really be a big help to the channel and to me personally if you found just the time to even write just a simple hi in the regular comment section. ATW taking me to take a break tomorrow because I'm doing really great. Well, thank you so much. Well, then reward me with a comment. You know what? Yeah. Thank you so much. This was a really fun one, a lengthy one, a girthy one, if you want. So from 9 to 5 Mac, there's nothing new. And I guess, and also nothing from 9 to 5 Mac. Benveni, that true lol. Why anyone would choose the Air if you get base model with better battery life, better camera, better sound, and promotion? Yeah, the better sound to me is also like, I've heard people say like, oh, you know what? I don't need like dual cameras. Most of the stuff I do is with the main camera, and I kind of relate to that. My most two used cameras are actually my main camera and then my telephoto camera, right? So that makes me firmly a pro user or a Pro Max buyer, right? But on a base model, I kind of don't need an ultra wide. I especially don't need like a last gen super soft ultra wide. So yeah, it's a bit of a personal question, but when it comes to speakers, it's really hard to say. Riley, since you are asking so nicely, I guess, even though you're kind of extorting me. Where's my OBS? Because we're slowly wrapping out, you know what? You guys can get Big Mark. You know, you like big marks and you cannot lie. Don't. That's the truth here. You cannot escape. Yeah, but especially if they bring the display size closer from the base model to, because you know what that means? That now means the Plus model basically gets a smaller display, down from 6.7 to around 6.6 inches. And that means that the base model gets up from a 6.1 to a roughly 6.3 inches. So that halves the difference, the distance that you had previously between the base and the Plus model. And at least the Plus model historically gave you way better battery life too. Now you might get not even battery life, but worse. The ATW saying, sure, I'll comment. Thank you to all. Yeah, it's now been almost 2.5 hours. Jesus. I guess time flows by. Riley's being happy with getting some big mark action on screen. So now I am really wrapping it up because my voice is starting to force me to. Thank you again to anybody who joined. Like, subscribe, share, comment. You got all your instructions. You can become a channel member. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, and Max Maximus, our MarkCheck Pro Max supporters. You can also become a supporter over on Patreon. Now that Patreon is doing this workaround about around the Apple App Store commission, it now makes more sense for you to support me there than on YouTube financially, but it's up to you. And last shout out to join the Discord, though I will keep mentioning it in upcoming videos. I believe we have 2 members here, so help us at least double that. And we'll see how it all develops. Of course, still promising to do the WWDC coverage leading up live and after. As always, let me know what else you would like to see me cover, any kind of improvements, any kind of specific suggestions, and we'll get deeper into interacting with the community, especially thanks to the Discord. Sometime after WWDC, we will look into whether you guys want to maybe call in. Please don't use slurs. I'll ban you. But I guess you guys are cool, right? So there's plenty that will be happening on the channel. Hit the notification bell so you actually know when I'm live next. I've heard some people in the comment section say that their notifications don't work. So at least try. YouTube is shit, but hey, we'll have to work around that, right? I mean, we looked into iOS being a mess, so I guess Android, I guess YouTube has some excuse to also be a mess. Thank you so much for everything. Oh, Benveni already joined the Discord. Yeah, the Discord is new. That's why I'm talking about it. I'm not, like, guys, I know this is like a small thing in my life. It's a hobby and whatever. But I do try to make this exciting and more direct for you. And since I left Twitter, I have felt the lack of that, because I really did have people who with me would comment under every 9 to 5 Mac Rumors article, right? Back in the day when Mark Gurman was there, you could also comment there. Of course, we see even stories like Ross Young posting there for his subscribers. That was missing, and I hope to bring some of that back through Discord. I even thinking of rejoining Twitter, but not personally, but this account entirely focused on the MarkTech channel and just like my personal interaction with technology and technology news, right? I will refrain from any kind of political commentary on that channel, on that account, even for my own mental health, but also just to not give Twitter any more of me, right? But that's about it. I will still keep, of course, your suggestions in mind where you think it's best for me to interact with you. Check out the Discord, check out the Blue Sky account, check out Threads. The links for that are in the description of this channel. I actually didn't forget this time. I'll also try to think of timestamps for this video, because that's also a common request afterwards, but we'll see. We'll see when I get to it, because for now I just need to eat. My blood sugar is probably somewhere down here. Thank you again. It's been a lengthy outro, just as it was a lengthy intro, girthy one, but it's about it for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys next time. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.